So this is CNET 121 in Science 37 for the people that showed up physically, face-to-face. And we're going to do Mod 6 and these Android forensics demos. And there was a problem with the Android device on Windows. People were unable to root it, so I just added a new project that fixes that problem, which I'll show you. So let me start with the lecture, which is in the Canvas. And there are two Canvases. There's the official City College one, and then there's the unofficial one on my server, which is identical, which everybody can get into if for any reason you have trouble with the City College one, which tends to happen. All right. So here's just some stuff about collecting evidence, which we've talked about several of these topics before. But anyway, so if you want to get evidence from a service provider like Google or Yahoo, then you often send them a preservation order, ordering them to retain records. That will cause them to not delete any records for 90 days, under penalty of being punished by the court if they do, and then you have time to develop a search warrant and get the data you need, if you're access to police, or court order if you're suing as a private party. So they might let the suspect know they're being investigated. A lot of them would like to do that. This has become really, really thorny since the Patriot Act. Many service providers have received national security letters, which, unlike most court orders, require them to not tell anybody that this person is being under investigation. And many service providers who value the privacy of their customers are very, very upset by that. They very much want to not release the information, and they very much want to let the customer know that they're being investigated. But the national security letters won't let them do that. They won't even let them talk to a lawyer or anything. They're really, really draconian. And a few services have just shut down business completely when they receive a letter like that, only to discover that even if you shut down business completely, it does not free you from the obligation of providing the data requested in the national security letters, which it's really draconian for America, although I think this is standard business in China. And of course, if anybody has the illusion that anything you do online is private, you should know that most people just comply with these orders depending on the company's position towards the government. But most large American businesses really want to get along with the government, and a few of them are effectively organs of the government, like AT&T. AT&T, after 9/11, handed over the entire internet traffic and the entire telephone traffic without any court orders to the government for years, in complete violation of the Fourth Amendment. And when this came out, Congress passed a special bill forgiving them for that, so they wouldn't be punished. So, I mean, they basically act as an organ of the government, and so it is a thing to understand. The civil liberties people aren't very happy about this, but that's the way it is in America. We pretend we're very, very different than China, and we are different, but we're not all that different. The large companies play ball with the government if they want to get along. Anyway, so you read an order like this to preserve data. Now, when you go to a crime scene, you have to record the information there. We talked about this before. There will be electronic devices, cables, other things like floppies and micro SD cards lying around and so on. So you first photograph or video everything, so you know exactly where it was when you first had it, because it might matter. There might be a note on an index card that tells you the password for a device. You need to know which device. There might be cables that you're going to have trouble reassembling back in the lab. So you photograph and document everything. Then you make a complete list of everything you pick up, including unique identifiers like serial numbers and so on, so that there won't be any argument later about which exact device you picked up. Then you bag it with a tamper-evident seal, so you'll be able to testify that nobody messed with it on the way back to the lab. You lock it, and that way you have a chain. The most important thing is make a chain of custody. You say, on this date at this time, I took the evidence, I secured it so nobody could mess with it, and I kept it under my control until I handed it off to this other person who is on the chain of custody form, and we can all go testify that there's an unbroken chain of custody, that somebody was making sure that this evidence was not being tampered with or altered from the time we seized it until the time you go to court. Wham, here it is, original evidence, this is the device. That's what you want. If you don't have an unbroken chain of custody, the value of the device is greatly diminished in court. So there are standards of how to seize devices from Secret Service and the Department of Justice and others to help guide you, but they're all pretty obvious. All right, and so you have you tag all your media devices you seize. You can have field kits that will let you actually copy evidence from devices at the scene, which you usually try to avoid, but sometimes you're taking it from machines you cannot seize, like company devices that are not being officially seized. You can still copy the evidence from them. And so the chain of custody, as I say, is a big deal. And it's just a list of who took legal custody of the device, who is able to go to court and testify. I really made sure nobody messed with it. I kept it in a sealed bag and I locked it in a safe, or I did whatever's necessary to make sure that nobody got to it and tampered with it. Then you have a computer worksheet with all the information to uniquely identify the computer and the parts that might be removed, like the hard drive and CD-ROM and all that jazz. Photograph everything. Your hard drive has a worksheet recording what type of hard drive it is and unique serial numbers and so on, and recording any errors or problems it may have. That often is the case, that there's read errors on the drive, so when you do a forensic image and you repeat it, you don't get the same MD5 hash because some of the blocks read unreliable and you want to record that fact. That doesn't make it worthless, but it does mean that some of the standard verification procedures won't work, and you should record that. Then you have a server worksheet. For a server, of course, you got lots of information you want to record just to make sure you uniquely identify the server and all its components, when it was seized, how you collected it, whether you shut it down or left it running or what you did, and all the cables and all the network information and so on. There are tools to help you do this, which are nothing more than just sort of a spreadsheet or a form to fill things out just to make sure you don't forget things. But that's really important, especially when you have a large group of investigators and some of your staff is not as well trained as others. You want to just give them a checklist to follow to make sure they do all the things that should be done. And of course, in practice, something almost always goes wrong. So you have procedures, and then there are exceptions and reasons why you couldn't do this or that. Like you seize a cell phone, but the cell phone is some bizarre model you cannot connect electronically, so you cannot really make an electronic image of the data, so you have to do some lesser procedure, like just paging through the screens and photographing it or something. All right, and you have to be aware of time zones. This is a huge problem for instant response and computer forensics. If you seize things in different time zones, you have to be very careful to make sure you understand how to connect those times together. I see a question here. Are there any such providers that value user privacy? Well, yeah, Apple does. Apple is probably the most extreme. I mean, Apple went so far as to refuse to let the FBI into the cell phone of a dead terrorist who blew things up and then died, and they still wouldn't let them in. Apple very, very, very much wants to tell their customers that they protect you from the government. In practice, they don't. If you turn on iCloud, they can get at that data. But if you don't turn on iCloud, and you leave the data only on your phone, the government will have an extremely hard time getting Apple to hand over the data on the phone, but they just go to Cellebrite, the Israeli company that sells them hacking software, which lets them blast through Apple's security and get stuff on the phone. So this is the problem with all security measures. This is why this is a common mistake in security. They call this Dr. No, where you tell people no all the time, so they just find a way to break your rules, sneak around your rules, like some other people do that I went to college rules. So Apple did that. Apple used to have a standard way to hand over the data on iPhones. I've heard police investigators talk about this. All you had to do was get a court order, pay them $300 fee, and you would mail them a hard drive, and they would copy all the data off the phone and put it on the hard drive and send it back to you. It was easy. It was a routine process. That's what everybody else does. Yahoo and Google, everybody just has a flood of law enforcement requests for data, and they just have a standard way of handling it. But Apple quit doing that. And they got frustrated, and they said, look, why did you quit doing that? That was fine, but they quit. So now they go buy hacking tools that punch through security, and now Apple has no control over them. This is what happens to anybody that makes security measures too harsh. Everybody just breaks the rules, and now what have you accomplished? Anyway, it does fund hacking companies like Cellebrite and Elcomsoft, although I hope American law enforcement is not using the Russian Elcomsoft company. I wouldn't. But the Israeli company Cellebrite has stuff that can punch through security as well. Anyway, so then you make a report. You're going to have to write a comprehensive report, and that's why Microsoft vulnerability reports are a good reference for this sort of thing. You have to reach two audiences. First, you have to have an executive summary which is non-technical. which somebody like a jury member or a judge can read and understand what you did. And then you have to have a technical appendix, which is for the opposing side's forensic examiner, which says exactly what you did in technical terms. The same thing's true of writing scientific publications. You have to have an introduction that is not technical, so people understand what you did and what it matters, and then details enough so another person can reproduce your findings. So that's the game. All right, so your report has a cover page with title and such, then a table of contents, an executive summary, like I said, which is here for non-technical people who just want to know what did you do and what did it mean. Not binary garbage, but I infected the device, it came from here, I found this on it, which is the important information. Then you have a biography describing who you are and your relevant experience so people can have a judgment of whether you're competent to do this. The purpose of the investigation, which may or may not be there, because the forensic examiner might possibly not know the purpose in any detail. They might just be looking at the device to see what's on there. And then your methodology, which will be quite detailed and probably in an appendix, and nobody will look at it except the opposing examiner, who will see what tool you used, what scripts you ran, what hash values you found, and so on, long lists of files and all that jazz, which will help the opposing examiner decide whether they agree that you did the right thing. Detailed media examined and your reported findings, which may include the output of a tool like FTK or Autopsy that gives you a report. It has an ability to make a report, but it's many pages listing all the files and hash values and stuff, so it's only in the appendix for the other examiner. No judge or anything is going to look through that stuff and worry about it. All right. And so here's your findings. And by the way, you have to be very careful. You do not prove that anybody is guilty. You don't say this guy downloaded images of children being abused. You don't know that. You don't know who did it really. All you know is what device you examined, what files you found, who was logged in at the time, things like that. You state things that are technical facts. During the pandemic, Dr. Fauci was wonderful at this. They would ask him, should there be a mask mandate? And he says, well, that's not my department. All I can tell you is masks have this chance of preventing the disease, and the vaccine has this chance of preventing the disease. He was a scientist, and he almost always succeeded in staying out of politics, staying in his lane. You know, all I know is the facts and the science. If you want an opinion about government or a law or anything, that's not what I'm here for. I'm just here to find the facts. Anyway, then have other details and appendices, photos, and so on, and perhaps a glossary is good. All right. So that's what I say. The expert witness is a special person in a trial. Other people can only say what they personally saw or heard. If they have information that they didn't personally observe, that is hearsay and inadmissible. But the only exception is the expert witness. The expert witness is able to have opinions, and those opinions are evidence. They can turn opinions into evidence because they have been recognized as an expert, and an expert having an opinion is considered to have some weight. So they can ask you a question like, this machine could have been infected with a virus that put that bad stuff on there. And now the expert witness can say, well, that's possible. A virus can do anything, but in my experience, that is extremely rare. I've never seen that, and I think that's not likely to be what happened here. And that's evidence to the extent that you believe the expert is credible. That's why it's all in how you seem to really know what you're saying, you seem to communicate clearly, you have impressive credentials, and so on. All right, and unfortunately, our legal system relies upon the jury deciding whether they can trust you, which in practice has turned out to be extremely unreliable, but it's the best we have. I mean, there's the great psychology studies that show how bad eyewitness testimony is. You do something right in front of people, and then you ask them what happened, and like 3/4 of them will get everything wrong. The sex of the person that did something, the clothes they were wearing, what order things happened in. It's amazing how bad human memory is, and yet eyewitness testimony is what we mostly rely on in court. It's disturbing. Anyway, all right. So there's your goals. Your goals are just the same as a teacher. They're to break down complicated stuff into clear terms so people can understand it. That's why teachers often become expert witnesses, but one flaw of teachers is they ramble and expound and go beyond the current thing and talk about relevant things, and you have to not do that. You have to stay carefully on target and not bring up anything that isn't necessary, because anything you say could lead to other questions, opening issues you don't want to open, questioning your credibility as you wander into areas you're not really an expert in. That's the hard part. They like teachers because they can do this. They can take a complicated thing and explain it, but they don't like teachers because they don't stay on target. Anyway, so you prepare your expert witness for trial. You're going to have a written report, usually, stating all your conclusions and what you're going to say, and of course your qualifications. That's really important. You absolutely have to. Your qualifications are what the jury's going to use in part to determine if they can trust you. And you have to list other cases, and you have to say how much you're being paid. These are all requirements. All right. And so make sure you're up to date. Make sure you have formal training. That's what my trainer told me. He said, now that you've taken this class, when they ask you, have you had formal training in forensics, you can say yes. And that matters. Anyway, and if you have certifications or awards or prizes or anything, that's all good too. All right. So you can be asked hypothetical questions. Like I say, they can ask you, could a virus have done that? And you are allowed to state an opinion. But just be sure you have a foundation for your opinion and you can justify it. You can also refuse to state an opinion, saying that is not an area in which I am an expert, but if it is, and you're dodging, then that will lower your credibility. Yeah.
Do you have to be independent to be expert?
Independent, you mean by not choosing prosecution or defense?
Yes.
No, I wish you did. The question is if you have to be independent. I originally thought you would. I came from the world of science research. I thought the expert is a scientist. They aren't taking either side. That is absolutely not what happens. They are on one side just like the lawyer. So you have to have a separate expert on the other side, and it is so bad that if you want to join the High-Tech Crime Investigators Association, which I'm in, you can't join if you ever worked on defense. Although somebody tells me they finally dropped that. I was really shocked when I heard that requirement. But their opinion was, we're on the prosecution and the defense lawyers are all on the other side, and we won't let them know our techniques or anything. Apparently they've removed that requirement, but evidently you are on one side or the other, which troubles me. That I wonder what you could do and still be honest.
So that's why you have to disclose what you're being paid, because you probably are being paid that way.
You are being paid, and usually high pay, and you're on one side or the other, and usually you specialize on one side or the other. If you want to be on prosecution, which is where you want to be, then you have to be trusted by the police. And that means you can't be working on the other side, and you have to have like a record of military service or something to impress them. And once you're in, you'd never work the other side. And if you do the other side, you can't get in. That's why this is a huge problem for beginning examiners, because you usually can't get into prosecution, can't work for the police because you haven't impressed them, you don't have a record in police work. And so the only cases you can get are defense, but if you do that, you don't gain progress of experience towards getting into prosecution, which is where you really want to be because it's steady work, and usually you're on the side of the angels. I mean, the fact is most people that are prosecuted are guilty. And so if you work for the police, you're mostly on the side of the right side. If you work for defense, you're mostly on the morally wrong side, except of course in the abstract sense that everybody deserves a defense, which is true, but I think it does wear on them, that you're helping people get out of jail who really belong in jail. But you need somebody to do it, but that's why it's a whole different job. Anyway, good, you gotta be courteous with everyone, especially. Don't interrupt anybody because everything is being transcribed, so you can't have two people talking at once. And you have to stay clear and polite even though you're gonna be attacked. One of my teachers told me he will never go to court, and he warns people, I'm not going to court. He says, his sister's a lawyer, I find out what happens in court, I'm terrified. He's a technical forensic examiner, but he won't go to court because he will be, of course, abused like a politician, insulted of stuff, anything dirt they can dig up on you. It's tough. I see some questions over here. Yeah, that's why they don't like people who have not done defense. Do expert witnesses have the option to say no to a case? Well, of course you do. I mean, to be fair, if you're on defense, the attorney hires you, and you can say, nope, I turned down the job. Of course, once you're on the job, I don't suppose you'd abandon them halfway through or you'd make them mad. I don't think it's illegal, but it would be a poor professional move. Yeah, that's right. You could say you don't want to defend someone you believe is guilty. Well, in that case, I think that would be highly unprofessional. I mean, an attorney hires you, they give you a hard drive or a computer to examine, and they say, find the evidence on here. If you then do the examination and then say, no, this person's guilty, so I don't want the case anymore, then everybody's wasted their time. You're not going to get paid. isn't that your job to find out if they're guilty? I mean, I've never heard of anybody doing that. That would be sort of nuts to try to get out of the case after you've done the examination. I mean, you've done the examination, it proves whether they're guilty or not. The fact is, even when people are guilty, you have to put on a defense. You say, well, you're pretty much hosed, here's the evidence, and this evidence is not on your side. But I mean, no, you don't usually jump ship after that. Anyway, all right, so be careful. Don't use words like probably, say facts, and if you have to state an opinion, say this is my opinion based on my experience. And you don't have weasel words like probably. And of course, be sure and use units of measurement so you're clear about what you're saying. Don't use shorthand or acronyms unless you explain them. This is a huge problem. I often complain on social networks. People, especially education professionals, will post. Back when I was on Twitter, I'd see it all the time. They'd have a post full of three-letter acronyms that mean nothing to me because people in the field have all these terms for things. Anyway, be careful of that. Technical people do use acronyms and think they're words, and you have to remember that you're talking to people who won't know your jargon. Jargon and slang get you in trouble. Anyway, let's take a look at a Kahoot for Mod 6. Yeah.
How do they pick the jury for these types of cases?
How do they pick the jury?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's always the same. I mean, they have a process where they have a pool of jurors and potential jurors. They bring them in, and then prosecution and defense examine them, and the judge. They ask some questions, to decide if you are biased, and then the two sides have an opportunity to remove jurors. So it takes, like a day to pick jurors. So each side has usually, the judge can throw anybody off that says something the judge doesn't like, and then the prosecution and defense can each throw like a certain number of people off without explaining why, and then a certain number of people, then they can also try to throw someone off for cause. So they'll ask you questions like, do you have a relative in law enforcement? Do you have personal experience with this kind of crime? And anything else that comes up. I mean, when I was on a jury, they asked me what I did for a profession. I told them I taught hacking, and they freaked out and said, it means you're a criminal. I had to explain that. It turns out 3 of the 12 people on our jury were in security. And so we had a vigorous discussion about that, deciding if I was therefore a criminal. They let me on, mostly because they asked me what to do about Snowden, and I said, you gotta lock him up. They liked that answer. Well, they also asked me, what would I do if one of my students hacked into somebody's email? And I said, I tell them you better knock it off, it's the wrong thing to do, and you better get a lawyer, now you're in trouble. They liked that answer too. All right, looks like we can go. All right, so what process do you perform by taking photographs? Okay, that's of course documenting the scene. All right, how do you prevent file deletion for 90 days? Okay, that's a preservation order. All right, what part of the report lists the college degrees of the examiner? That's the biography. All right, and how about what part contains the photographs of seized objects? I think there are 2 typos in that question. Anyway, there's the exhibits. Good. All right. So it is Jose. All right. CGSF rules. I think I know who that is. CF12 Pro. I think I know who that is too. So CF12 Pro. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.